You know, she was unlikely to be the leader. Our very well-known Queen Elizabeth was born on April 21, 1926. She was the first daughter of the second son, and so lived her happy royal life until 1936, where her uncle David decided that he didn't particularly enjoy the life of servanthood, and he certainly didn't enjoy being the king. In fact, he was much more excited about the life of partying and fell in love with a divorcee, which was against the law at that time for the king to marry a divorcee. And so he chose the love of his life over his role as king and abdicated the throne, which meant that his brother, who had a stuttering problem, who had never even wanted to be king, went to the throne. And this little 8-year-old girl became the heir presumptive. That if anything happened to the king, then she was next in line. Nobody ever expected that this would happen because King David, well, King Edward, I think was his official name, David was supposed to go onto the throne, get married, have some kids, including a boy, and his line would continue on the throne. But that didn't occur, and this young lady all of a sudden shot to leadership. In 1947, she married Philip, who was a prince in Denmark, but the royal family of Denmark and Greece had fallen apart, and so he renounced his royal titles in Denmark and became Elizabeth's husband. Well, they began their married life, they had 2 children, and then they were asked to go on a royal tour. They were to tour Kenya, then Australia and New Zealand. But on the 6th day of their tour, the king, at just 56 years old, died of lung cancer. And all of a sudden, Elizabeth, at age 27, was now the Queen of the Commonwealth. It was very unexpected that that this trip would lead to her father's death. Historians think, and I'm not a historian, so I apologise if there are any historical inaccuracies in my presentation this morning, that there was a small group of people that knew that he had lung cancer and was dying, but he told no one. So his family didn't know, and of course the people didn't know. So in fact, you see pictures of her leaving, smiling on her tour, and they actually had to bring a black dress onto the plane, and she changed into that dress on the plane when she arrived back from Kenya and came back out in mourning. And so now the royal family always travels with a black outfit, just in case a world leader or a family member or someone passes away and they need to honour them. But this unlikely woman who sat on the throne has now been the longest-serving female monarch in history. And in 2016, she became the longest-serving monarch alive in our world today. The Thai king was the longest serving for a while, and she took over from him. And it was her great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, who'd been the longest serving female monarch before her. So that's a good 65-ish years of being on the throne and being a leader that we'd never expected that we would have ever had. So what do we learn from this amazing lady? What do we see about her leadership that's given it longevity over such an amazing length of time? Well, the first thing I would argue this morning is it's been faithfulness. This is before, she was just a young woman in this picture. She was 21 years old and it was World War II. And they wanted to take the royal family and whisked them off to some safe place somewhere, and they refused to go. And in fact, she joined, I think it's the Women's Auxiliary League, and she trained as a mechanic. I gotta give that some respect. Because if you're a royal with that amount of money, living in Windsor Castle, doing all those sorts of things, to actually choose to stay in the war zone, and to not only stay in the war zone but to contribute, is a level of faithfulness. In fact, on her 21st birthday, when she gave her presentation and one of her speeches, she said of her royal life that it was her role to help, and that she was there to serve. And fundamentally, she's been faithful to her statement that she was there to serve. In fact, I love this picture. There she is, in a bizarre hat. Let's not talk about fashion for a second, but that's the Manchester bombing. And she's going to visit these kids that have been at a pop concert that you can't imagine that an 86-year-old queen knows much about. But there's a woman who's faithful. There's a woman who turns up. It's interesting that people often say that William and Harry are so much like their mother. But I would argue that they're very much like their grandmother. Harry came to New Zealand when it was the New Zealand earthquakes. I was living there at the time. And in the same year that Christchurch had all their earthquakes, there was a really bad mining accident. A number of men were killed. Harry didn't just visit Christchurch, he visited the little tiny town of Greymouth where the mining accident occurred. In her years as Queen, she's visited 116 countries and she's made 256 royal visits. Like, that's abroad. That doesn't even count what she does in her own country. That's one international visit per quarter for 65 years. That's a level of faithfulness from a woman who was never expected to be the leader, and so she never went to primary school or high school. She was trained in the Constitution and in art. She doesn't have any education whatsoever. Yet she has faithfully turned up in the lives of the people that she serves every quarter for 65 years. The next thing I love about Queen Elizabeth is that she was an innovator. I've lost the word. I was going to say abdication, but when you put the crown on, her coronation, that's right. Got the word back to front there. Her coronation was the first to be seen on television. In fact, it was the first royal event ever to be on television. She was the first world leader to send an email in 1976. You could think that she would be somebody who would just keep things the same. But over and over again, she has, with that theme of faithfulness, attempted to make change in the royal family. Her sister had a thing for the king's assistant. His name was Peter, and he was married at the time, so let's just be honest about the story here. And then he got divorced, and they tried to get together and marry. But of course, it was against the law to be in a relationship with a divorcee because you were in conflict with the church. But Queen Elizabeth actually tried to really help them work through that situation so they could be together. And she petitioned Winston Churchill and she petitioned government, and she tried to actually innovate that law. Whether we agree with divorce or not, we could agree that it's innovation. So when Charles married Camilla, she had been working on the innovation of changing the marriage laws since she came to the throne in 1952. So not only did she innovate, but she persistently innovated. She kept going at things until she was able to make them happen. So poor Philip felt very disempowered because he couldn't give his children his name. When she became queen, they went to the House of Windsor. And he said, but I'm the only man in the Commonwealth who cannot give my children my name, the House of Mountbatten. And it took her 10 years. But in 1962, she had it changed to the House of Windsor Mountbatten. I think that's innovation, but in a particularly faithful and committed way. The third thing I love about Queen Elizabeth is she had public grace and private wisdom. She's reigned over 13 prime ministers, and she's reigned over some particularly difficult situations. Do you remember the year 1992? What happened to the royal family in that year? Queen Elizabeth was egged by people she visited in Germany. That was the year both of her son and her daughter divorced, and then her third son divorced. It was also the year of the fire. And I watched some YouTube clips of the time of the fire, and they're interviewing Prince Andrew, and there's water going and you can see fire in the background and there's media everywhere, and somebody said, "Where's the Queen?" And he said, "Oh, she's helping the staff take out all the precious items." Grace under pressure, grace in an emergency. I didn't understand until I did this research that it was the Queen who suggested that Charles and Diana should divorce. In 1991 and 92, their unhappiness was becoming so very public and so very difficult. You saw Diana spiralling down into a very difficult situation. And so the Queen privately consulted with the Prime Minister, with Parliament and with the Church, and then she wrote them a letter suggesting that it would be in everybody's best interest if they would part ways. Now, I don't know how you graciously, in the same year that your house burns down, keep carrying out the prized possessions, keep doing your royal tours with graciousness, and wisely try and negotiate your family in a very public world through all that difficulty, unless you've got some wisdom. In fact, it was Queen Elizabeth who agreed that the royal family, after all these years, would pay taxes. I see a woman of faithfulness, I see a woman of innovation, and I see a woman of wisdom. Yet when I remind myself that she had no formal training, that she had no education, that she was never considered the one likely to lead, I am amazed that everything she has given so faithfully has blessed so many. In fact, when I think about the picture of her life, this is the scripture that comes to mind. Luke chapter 21, verses 1 to 4. And he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury, and he saw also a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites. So he said, "Truly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all, for all these out of their abundance have put in offerings for God, but she, out of her poverty, put in all the livelihood that she had." It's an interesting little story, and it kind of came to me about 7 or 8 years ago, this idea that, somebody would be putting in all that they have and giving in a way that Jesus would say is abundant. And I tell you when it came to me. All of you are aware that I have severe food intolerances, and when I first was diagnosed, I was living in New Zealand and trying to travel through the Pacific, and I went on this trip to New Caledonia, and unexpectedly they had forgotten to do an itinerary for me to to do for my 12 days in New Caledonia. And so they decided they would take me to the very north of New Caledonia. Now, I have a very limited diet, and so was travelling with, a portion of food that I could work with. And so then to take me out of the city and away from the shops, and I tried to get some things, but basically by about day 10, I was starving. I'd hardly had a decent meal. My little stock supply of things that were keeping me going were running out. I was sleeping in a tent, and because I was unprepared, I had this lovely Laura Ashley cardigan that I was putting over my blankets because I was freezing. You get the picture of the situation. I was propositioned by a drunk miner in the park that we were staying in, because I was the one young-looking white woman in this place, and, not particularly, it didn't create a level of safety for me that, when my boss found out later, was very unhappy about. So you're getting the picture. So I've got this little bag of dried chickpeas, and I've got a third left in the bottom of my bag, and I'm sitting there. And of course, still today, whenever I go and eat somewhere, it creates a lot of attention and discussion, because here I am not eating the healthy things and not eating vegetables, and I just always explain, and this is what I do and this is why I do it. And so of course I'm sitting there and somebody goes, "Oh, what is it that you're eating?" And I'm like, "Oh, they're dried chickpeas." And then she said the most profoundly confronting thing of my life: "Can I have one? I'm cold, I'm tired, I'm starving, and she wants one of my chickpeas." Bizarrely though, this passage of scripture came to my mind. Here I am with my mite, my tiny little bit, the last of what I've got. Do I give it? And I confess to you that I gave it with dreadful spirit. I went, yeah, sure. And I kind of held out my little bag, and she took one and pulled it back. And I went home and I got out my commentaries and I started reading about this passage. What is it that Jesus is really trying to say here? Is Jesus saying that I have to give my last chickpea to people who've got abundance, who've got food all around them? Well, interestingly enough, some commentators have, been quite harsh about this passage for that reason. Because at a quick reading, you can kind of go, yeah, Jesus is saying, give it all. Give till you've got nothing. Give till you are cold and wet and tired and, people, sell your houses, give up your superannuation, live in your cars, sell the car, get a tent. In fact, I could almost hear this passage being used by those who would misuse the Bible for their own personal gain. I can hear cult leaders taking this passage and going, give everything. That's what Jesus said, give until you have nothing. Is that really the message of this passage? Because for me, it doesn't have internal consistency. Is Jesus really suggesting recklessness? And was that consistent with Jesus' philosophy? I would argue it's not. Jesus never suggested recklessness or suggested that we live a life of destruction. So maybe we need to look deeper at this passage to understand what it's saying. And of course, the first way we always look deeper at a passage is to look at its context. So let's go back to Luke chapter 20, verses 45 to 47. While all the people were listening, Jesus said to his disciples, "Beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted with respect in marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honour at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished severely." Right? Do you see the two pictures that the writer has put so beautifully together? I try and imagine this one as photographs. Snap. See this? Here's the religious leaders flapping about in their fancy outfits, making themselves powerful, putting money in the box and doing it for show, doing it because they've got something to gain, making sure that people can see it so that they will be praised, so that they will be seen and considered to be spiritual, so that they will hold their position as a religious leader in this community. Snapshot 1. And then Jesus goes, bang. See this picture. Snapshot 2. Here's the woman who's giving when nobody's watching. She's giving when she's got nothing to gain from giving. She's giving out of everything that she's got. She's giving from her heart. Now, again, if we understand the context, is she giving to the point that her children have no food to eat? Well, again, if we understand who she was, then we'll understand that Jesus is not advocating recklessness. She was a widow, the lowest of society, and while we are not 100% certain, it's exceptionally likely that she would have been a day worker. That's the best a widow with money is likely to have, because if her husband had been rich, that would have gone to his brother or to a son. But she would have been a day worker, which meant she would have gone out into the field, she would have been given some mites for her day's work, she would have gone home and eaten her meal, and then she would have gotten up the next morning and found a field to work in and be given some mites for her day's work. So when she was giving everything today. And tomorrow, she would go back to work and get wages for tomorrow. So it's almost like us today, we're paid fortnightly, right? It's almost like us going, you know what? I normally give 20, but I'm going to give 100 this fortnight. And I know I've got food in the cupboard and I'm going to make it through to next fortnight and I'll be paid again next fortnight. But I'm going to give this faithfully from this fortnight's wages. But to be able to give that way, to be able to give and say, I can give this and I'm okay, then we need to be able to live Jesus' philosophy. Matthew chapter 6, verse 28 to 34. So why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. And yet I say to you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Now if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Therefore, do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For after all these things the Gentiles seek. For your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. You can see why Jesus took a picture of her, don't you? Because here's a woman who gets this. You know what? I've got food for today. I've had work for today. I can give today. It's not going to gain me anything. It's not going to change anything. I'm giving with nothing to gain and nothing to lose, because she has to have had a level of trust and faith in God's provision and support for her in this day. So you can see when we put our overlay onto this woman's life of our weekly, fortnightly, yearly tax plans, our superannuation budgets and our big picture, that the story doesn't quite gel with us. But to be able to put it in the context of Jesus' philosophy and her world, where Jesus was saying, hey, it's okay, live today. Today's got enough trouble of its own. Solve today and move on to tomorrow. And in that way, I would argue the snapshot that Jesus is giving us is of a woman that's giving hook-free. Now, let me explain. Have you ever had something given to you and then you feel obligated because it was given to you? Do you know that feeling? I don't know if there's a technical term for that, but I call it a hook. So somebody gives to you, but they're actually trying to get their own needs met. They want you to praise them, or they want you to say thank you, or they want you to do you a favour later on, right? And so you're kind of being given this present, but it's got a little hook in it and a little fine, like fishing line. Here's the present, but I kind of actually want to reel back something for myself. Working in the welfare world, it's a really dangerous thing for people to be giving with a hook, because they go in and go, I'm giving to this person, but what I want to get out of this is my self-esteem. So you're vulnerable and I'm going to help you, but then I'm going to be a good person because I did that helping. You see what I mean by the hook? And that's why I love Jesus' principle. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and love your neighbour as you are loving yourself. Because when a person is in a secure place that their needs are met, then between the love we have of God and how we care for ourselves, then you can really give unconditionally without that kind of hook in it. Because our faith is in God that He's providing for us. Our position is certain and clear because we are sorted in God's love, in our relationship with Him and in our relationship with ourselves. So as we relate to others, we relate in a clean way. So the other way I look at it is when people do things to get their own needs met, even though it looks like they're doing it for someone else, it's messy, it's dirty. It's, like it's icky. Do you know the feeling? It's yuck. So that's why I call it clean. To be able to really give in a clean way that says, I am secure and I'm gaining, I've got nothing to gain and nothing to lose. And as I reflect on my own giving over my life, there have been times that I've given so somebody would tell me that I was okay. So somebody would tell me that I was skilled or that I was great, so that I would belong or I would be important. But as I reflect on the times that I've given, when I've got, there's no chance of gaining anything and there's nothing left to lose because I've, given from this place of security in Jesus, it's the best kind of giving. It actually feels better. It feels great because it isn't so messy. It's, I don't even know how to put words to it sometimes to describe it, but you're with me, right? You understand what I'm saying? So this beautiful little passage where she puts in her 2 mites and Jesus says, truly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than them all. She's actually done it, here's Kylie's interpretation of it, because the commentators are still arguing. So this is just my worldview on this passage. She's done it better. She's actually done it cleaner. She's done it in more of a place of abundance than somebody who's put in more money but done it with the complete wrong motives. And he says, for all these out of their abundance have put in their offerings, but she out of her poverty put in all the livelihood that she had. She gave it her best shot. And she, an unlikely leader, points us to the way. To a way of giving that is faithful. In fact, no one would ever call the widow and her mite a leader, yet she points us like a leader does in the direction of God's kingdom, of the upside down ways that God works in the world, the upside down ways that God is calling us to. It's sad that the religious leaders were not able to point in that direction, that in fact In this situation, they were followers. And the most unlikely woman in the temple that day faithfully leads us and shows us how God works. It reminds me that so often God's kingdom is seen in the vulnerable and in the least likely to show us his principles. I forget that. I forget that God's power is made manifest in our weakness, not in our strength. But I'm reminded of a story that happened many years ago. My first real job was actually in a group home in a disability service that the Adventist Church runs in Western Australia. And there was a woman in that home, and her name was Di. And Di's parents owned a bakery, and we're talking this was 20 years ago, so Di would have been raised 30 years ago, like 40 years ago. She was in her 40s at the time, so 50 years ago her parents were trying to manage a moderately to profoundly disabled woman. She didn't speak very much, she had a few words. And the words were wooey, and she would go wooey, wooey, and she knew her name, so she'd go die-de-die-de-die-de-die. But because she was born in a bakery, die-de-die, was often behaviour management happened through bakery items. And so she would sit in the bakery and eat most of her life. And Didi was quite focused on food. So one of my amazing memories of Didi is I got her up one morning and she was, not in a dignified state. She was wet right through. And I said, "Come on, Didi, we're going off to the bathroom." But as we walked from her bedroom to the bathroom, we passed another resident sitting at the kitchen table eating food. And that was it. Didi was like, "I'm going to have my breakfast." I'm like, no, Didi, you can't sit there like that, hun. That's just uncomfortable. We've got to go and have a shower. Well, she was not pleased with my, exertion of choice and control that she couldn't, in a messed up state, eat her breakfast. And so we get into the bathroom and she's going, woo-wee, woo-wee, and she's like throwing shampoo bottles at me, and she was crying and screaming and hurling soap and all these things at me because she wasn't allowed to have her breakfast. And so it was easy to think that Didi's life was about food and about having her food routine. Well, I worked in that place for nearly 12 months, and it was brand new, and they had hardly any workers, and they'd brought somebody across from Queensland, and that person hadn't worked out, and so I did the night shift for months and months and months at a time because they were short-staffed. In fact, I worked from 9 at night till 7 in the morning. I drove home, I slept until 3 o'clock, I got up, I went to uni from 3 till 9, and then I went back to work. And I'd done that for months and months and months, even though I was only supposed to be 2 days a week. And I never got any of the good shifts and any of the day shifts or anything. And we had a resident there who was quite a bit more able until she went into an institution and came out of the institution with behaviours like screaming all night, hitting herself on the head, doing all sorts of awful things. So when it came to the end of the year, I'd finished university and I applied for the full-time position that was going. And I went away on holidays for a few weeks, and I came back 45 minutes early because I thought I'd find out, what's going on. And I walked in the door, and my boss, who I should have recognised at the time, was only 27, and I was only 20, she went, "No, you won't be working full-time here. Glad you're early. We've given it to someone else." "Great, can you go and get this, pick this resident up from work?" And so I got in the car and I was really upset. I'd really flogged myself for nearly a year to help make this thing work, and this woman had really just pretty poor HR and just kind of really diminished me. So I get to the place to pick up this resident who kind of really struggled, and she wouldn't get in the car with me. I suspect she could sense that I was distressed and there was no way she was getting in the car with me. And so she paced back and forward in the car park for 45 minutes until I had to ring my boss, who came, and she arrived and the resident just got in her car and drove off. And as I came back to work, my boss went, "Aren't you glad the knight in white shining armour came to rescue you?" And that was it. I'm 20 years old. I've just finished university. I was just discouraged. And so to avoid crying, there were 2 units, and with a door between them. Some residents lived in each unit. I went to the next door unit and I found Didy doing what only Didy does best, having afternoon tea and having a cup of tea. Where else would you expect Di to be? And I sat down and said, "I haven't seen you since I've been on holidays, Didy. How are you?" She's just eating a cup of tea and going, "Didy, Didy, Di." I said, "Oh, I haven't had a very good day, Di." And I had my hand like this and she went to grab it and I thought, "Oh, that's nice." And she sort of pushed me away. She turned my hand over and she reached out and she grasped my hand and she patted it. And I kind of went, "Hasn't been a very good day." And she just patted my hand. Compassion, empathy, understanding. Gosh, HR practice. Nobody taught Didy to do that. Didy responded to the human need she saw in front of her. Something my well-paid coordinator wasn't able to do that day. Di, Queen Elizabeth, the widow and her mite are unlikely leaders. But they lead us to one of Jesus' principles, that it's often in our greatest vulnerability that we're really able to give. And it's my prayer today that each of us will give, knowing that God's got it, that today we're going to be okay because the God of the universe cares for us and he cares for the birds of the air, and you and I are not forgotten. So today it's going to be okay. So we can give even in our vulnerability, even without education, even without money, even with the 2 little mites of time we've got left to give. We can give. And we can lead people to the God of the universe who gives amazingly.